Hi, my name is Dr. Holden Stichtenstein, and I'm a formerly leading expert on the subject of cloning. You know, cloning's a bit of a hot topic these days, and I was brought in by your local GBS affiliate to talk about the dangers of trying to create some clones on your own at home. Hey, can we get someone to change out the graphic? It looks like the TD just put up a picture of a meth lab. In particular, I'm gonna be talking about an oldie but a goodie that's becoming a wee bit popular thanks to the power of TikTok. Word on the street is that you Zoomers or whatever are using this blood ritual in order to get a Legend of Zelda clone because the new one happens to cost $10 more than they usually do. Yeah, you heard me right! A bunch of you kids are summoning literal demons to possess your Sega Genesis just because you don't want to pay for the new Legend of Zelda game. And I'm here to tell you that that's not such a good idea! Don't get me wrong, ancient blood rituals are actually pretty dope. Back when I was your age, the boys and I used to chug bottles of Robitussin and do them all the time while we played Dungeons and Dragons. But this ritual is actually fairly no bueno. 4 out of 5 people who summon demons to possess the Sega Genesis end up deader than Bin Laden or as regretful as a Red Sox fan after you've reminded them that they traded Babe Ruth to the Yankees. Wait, really? Jesus Christ. Take it from me, a 4th level paladin that could chug a bottle of Robitussin, do a handstand down a flight of stairs and not break his pelvis. You don't want no demons up in your house. Don't believe me? Let's talk to a TikToker who did summon a demon and then had to watch as the little rascal played paper shredder with his mom, dad, sister, and fiance. That's right, you can't because he's deader than Bin Laden. So don't do it. Just don't. Don't offer a blood ritual to Sega so that you can play Crusader of Centy at home instead of just getting Tears of the Kingdom. No amount of video gamery affection or the touch of another human being will ever be worth summoning a demon. Take it from me, a Robitussin addict who used to be a doctor.
It's not worth risking your life.
Like hell I won't!
Hey guys, 'tis I Niche, and oh man, I screwed up. I accidentally summoned a demon who stabbed me in the chest and said something about plunging New Jersey into 10,000 years of darkness before running off into the sunset, and I think that was wrong of me to do, maybe? Anyway, I've been down here for a few days losing a lot of blood, and I have no idea when anyone's gonna check on me, so if it's alright with you, I think I'll just talk about Crusader of Centy for the Sega Genesis to distract myself for a bit. Released throughout 1994 and 1995, Crusader of Centy, which is also known as Soleil and Ragnacenty in Europe and Japan respectively, is a top-down action game for the Sega Genesis by Nextech. It revolves around a silent protagonist named Corona as he explores the fictional kingdom of Centy in order to train and become a hardened warrior before questing to improve the world he lives in and put an end to a war between its humans and monsters. Despite being attributed to Nextech as its developer, it was actually primarily created by GAO Entertainment, a smaller studio that had been absorbed by Nextech while it was being made and had actually only released one other title in its lifetime, which was 1993's Ranger X. Ironically, what would have been the second game for GAO ended up being just that for Nextech 2, as the only other game they had put out themselves since being formed was a licensed Yu Yu Hakusho game that had come out in January of 1994. Tangentially, and if I could just will this into existence, I really hope that Yu Yu Hakusho game gets an English patch too someday because I'd love to cover it on my channel. You know, just want to put out some good vibes in the world. I think my lung's collapsing. Anyway, the game was created to kick off Sega's Mega Role-Playing Project, a promotion that was centered around the company releasing a number of RPGs in Japan to help boost the relatively low sales of their hardware in the region. And probably because it was designed to fulfill the campaign's intent of putting out high-profile games in a massively popular genre within the country, it decided to crib quite a bit of the design found in one of the biggest franchises on the planet, Nintendo's Legend of Zelda series. Something that's kind of ironic given the fact that most people wouldn't even consider The Legend of Zelda to be an RPG in the first place these days. However, I won't pretend that the idea of Sega trying to will their own Legend of Zelda game into existence for their console doesn't make a lot of sense. After all, Sega already had their own Mario and Sonic the Hedgehog, and 1991's A Link to the Past had been a monumental critical and financial success for their rivals at Nintendo. It was honestly just a sound business decision on Sega's part to try and grease the wheels on their console having a competitive alternative to that title. At the same time though, it's also a bit of a shame that their intention of making a Zelda clone became the most notable thing that people want to bring up whenever they talk about this game. Upon its release, Crusader of Centy received some fairly positive reviews from critics around the world. For example, the UK publication Mean Machines gave it a glowing 92 out of 100 in their December 1994 issue, with one of their editors saying that it was, quote, a massive absorbing game with some wonderful graphics and animation, before another followed up with a comment that Soleil is, quote, an absolutely essential purchase for anyone even vaguely into the weird and mystical world of RPGs. And over in America, things were also fairly positive, with EGM's March 1995 magazine, who repeatedly misnamed the game by the way, saying that it was one of the best games they had seen on the Genesis in a while, and that it was a welcome addition to a library in serious need of some good RPGs. Since then, the game's basically become a bit of a boogeyman amongst retro gamers. A lot of people definitely know what it is, and that it's a great title for the Genesis and all, but they've also never played it for one reason or another, and it also never seems to come up whenever people are discussing the truly great or even underrated cult titles of yesterday. Personally, I think a lot of that has to do with its undeniable similarity to A Link to the Past and how it was invented to be Sega's composite for that title. In the same way that a lot of people tend to immediately consider a copycat or mockbuster movie automatically worse than the movie that inspired it, or a band jumping on the coattails of another famous act as being unoriginal sludge, it's entirely possible that some clone games like Crusader of Centy are getting unfairly disregarded due to the existence of the original as opposed to just being considered a supplement to that piece. It feels as though people assume that copying or taking very obvious inspiration from something is like getting a 6th or 7th generation copy of a cassette. That it's lost a lot of the nuance and fidelity that made the original such a thrill to experience in the first place. And in a number of cases and ways, I think they may be right, but also that this line of thinking is kind of black and white and could lead to missing out on some truly great gems out there. Especially if you've already experienced the original and want more of it without being able to find it in the first place. I'll talk about that and explore it more towards the end of the video though. Right now, I just want to say that I was really surprised by everything that Ragnacenty had to offer. I wouldn't call it a perfect game by any stretch of the word, but if every game that you could play by unleashing the servants of the devil onto the earth were this good, I genuinely say that humanity as we know it is in serious trouble. Did I leave my TV on? Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. So, let's say one of your favorite games did summon Hellspawn that would try to kill you once you finish playing it for the day and go on to wreak havoc on the planet. What game are you picking anyway and why? Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. On top of that, feel free to subscribe and share this video with your friends or anywhere you see fit if you're enjoying what you see so far, because it goes a long way in helping the channel grow. No, really, it does. You can also subscribe to my Patreon or buy me a coffee if you want some bonus goodies and want to support the channel that way too. And if it isn't too much to ask, maybe you could also, get me help? I've been down here for a while and I think I'm starting to lose it, guys. The blood's really cold and I'm losing a lot of ground. Anyway, with that out of the way, on with the video. The game opens on the main character Corona's 14th birthday, which he's celebrating with his mother and his friends. In his hometown of Soleil, it's law for boys that have just turned 14 to begin training in order to defend the town from getting attacked by monsters. After being gifted his father's old and rusty sword, Corona's sent to the King of Centy, who orders him to begin his training at the nearby training ground where you'll learn how to throw your sword like a boomerang and have access to 3 obstacle courses you need to complete in order to upgrade your sword later in the game. From there, you'll begin a quest to uncover every corner of the map while you help those in need before venturing through time itself to prevent the monsters from ever becoming a problem in the first place.
What the hell is that?
You know what it is, bitch.
Bang!
Crusader of Centy is a fairly linear action-adventure game that takes the basic bones from a Legend of Zelda title and reformats them somewhat to make it their own while also remaining fairly recognizable to fans of that series. It's got all the bells and whistles you'd expect from a top-down adventure game, such as close and ranged combat, unlockable abilities to help you navigate its many dungeons and puzzles within those dungeons to keep you on the edge of your seat.
But wait, there's more.
For starters, the game has a couple of deviations from the Zelda formula, such as how it completely lacks an overworld and instead allows you to automatically travel from area to area using a map. It also pins your unlockable abilities to animal buddies you unlock throughout the game as opposed to items, doesn't focus on storytelling anywhere near as much as A Link to the Past does, and last, but certainly not least, even allows you to jump whenever you want. Ha! Take that, Zelda! You're never getting up from that one again, are ya? Oh, neither am I. These are some pretty nice changes to throw in, and they're somewhat successful in giving the game a chance to stand out from what the competition had. Because of the lack of an overworld, I noticed that Crusader of Centy had an absolutely breakneck speed to it that I never really associated with the Legend of Zelda franchise. That's not to say that Zelda games are necessarily slow or anything, but rather that Crusader of Centy was just that fast-paced compared to them. Whereas Zelda games had, starting with Link to the Past funnily enough, started to emphasize storytelling and ambience in conjunction with its strong gameplay, Crusader of Centy feels like it never really got to establish its world and the rules that govern it. All we really know for a decent chunk of the ride is that there are evil monsters that have been hiding ever since the emergence of light on the planet, and that they're up to no good, maybe, kind of, sort of. From there, the game's really more about the individual cases of fighting back evil for a while before the story eventually expands to be about the grander scale of the state of the world. Tonally, what I'm trying to say is that I may not even try to compare it with The Legend of Zelda at all. If anything, it feels a bit more appropriate to compare it to Star Tropics than it does the adventures that Link's known for in that regard on account of how much humor the game has in it. It's hardly a hoot and a half in the same way that the aforementioned late NES release was, but it feels about as uninterested in being particularly grand or epic. There's nothing wrong with that or anything. It actually feels like a very deliberate choice on the part of Nextech and Gao, and it does help the game stand out a bit. However, it's also an interesting and somewhat classically Sega move in regards to how they choose to compete with their competition over on a Nintendo console. It reminds me of how the Alex Kidd games were Sega's inaugural attempt to make a better Mario game than Nintendo could. Ragna Crusader of Soleil's lightheartedness similarly harkens back to Alex Kidd's silly and child-friendly tone too, and it somewhat ironically reminds me of Son Goku's second quest to find the Dragon Balls in Akira Toriyama's classic manga of the same name, as well as the filler episodes in the anime where Goku would try and seek out adventure as a form of training leading up to the 22nd Tenkaichi Budokai Saga. I say ironically because, believe it or not, Alex Kidd in Miracle World had actually begun its life as a Dragon Ball game before Sega lost the license and decided to rework it into the title we know today. Corona's quest reminded me of those chapters from the manga because of the way that they felt really episodic. Without an explorable overworld connecting the different areas of the game, the actual Kingdom of Centy feels disjointed and never entirely comes together as being one cohesive place. Because of this, those earlier sections of the game that find you entering a new area, battling a boss, and chatting with NPC humans or animals feel extremely siloed from any sort of larger story, which the game definitely has, like I mentioned earlier, but also feels fairly downplayed in terms of its importance. Frankly, my dear, and oh god, I didn't realize we were dating. I hope things don't get too serious because my girlfriend might have a problem with that. The game's storytelling is also just really ineffectual. Like, okay, yeah, I mentioned how the game has what I'd describe as a sort of chill/laid back, we retired and moved to Florida so we stopped trying years ago vibe, but my main issue isn't that the vibes are off or whatever, it's that the actual parlance of its story feels like an afterthought. Thankfully though, while the story felt somewhat underdeveloped and, okay, I'll just say it, generic on top of that, almost everything outside of that felt like it had gotten more than enough love and attention from Gao and his rad new dad at Nextech before being shipped to consumers. I mean, like, look at this thing, it's friggin' gorgeous! The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past was far from being a slouch when it came to its visuals too, but good lord, it's no wonder you needed a damn blood ritual to play this thing. It's one of the best looking Genesis games I've ever laid my eyes on. Seriously though, it is. Soleil's got heaps and heaps of aesthetically pleasing smooth animation under the hood, a bright, vibrant, and wide color palette that could easily make it pass for a SNES or Game Boy Advance game, and as if that weren't enough, even manages to throw in some really nice layering in a few of its environments. Sprites are nice and detailed, there's a good amount of dithering used in lieu of transparency, and some of the environmental assets pop from having a bit of animation added to them. I know it may come across as an exaggeration on my part, but I really mean it when I say that I was blown away by how clean this game looks. I can only imagine how impressive this had to have looked back in the day, especially coupled with the higher resolution of Genesis games compared to ones on Nintendo's 16-bit hardware. Making things even better is the fact that the game largely runs at a solid 60 frames per second. It's admittedly prone to slowing down whenever a lot of fast-moving enemies or obstacles are on screen, namely bees, which is actually a bit hilarious on account of how it makes you feel like you're Neo trying to dodge them and all, but I'd hardly call it a problem since those moments are rather few and far between anyway. One of the things I really enjoyed about this game's visuals though was how varied everything was. Without any towns or forest areas to get lost in between stages, So-Olay's various areas all feel relatively unique. Every level in the game had its own unique look and theme going for them, such as a luscious beach, a ravenous volcano, ice, and a deserted village that's in the middle of a desert. And if you want to tie things back to my Dragon Ball comparison from earlier, the first area you visit as an adventurer even looks a bit like Namek, especially when you compare it to the way the planet looked in the first Dragon Ball Z Legacy of Goku game. A game that I can finally confirm is worse than getting stabbed. Maybe. Even better, their differences aren't just cosmetic. Traversing to these areas will often require you to make use of the different abilities that you'll unlock during your adventure in order to get past a certain obstacle, and while that's far from unique and basically how Zelda games have always operated, it does a pretty good job of making you feel like you're breaking new ground as an adventurer. There's a nice little sense of discovery to using your abilities in order to get around, especially because the abilities offered to you themselves are pretty cool. It's also really cool that these abilities come to you in the form of animal buddies too. It kinda reminds me of the buddies you'd meet on your adventure in Paper Mario, if anything. My personal favorite of the 16 abilities you can unlock was the cheetah you get somewhere around halfway through the game. Equipping him turbocharges your character and gives him the ability to sprint at twice his previous speed, which can be a bit hard to maneuver and stuff even with 8-directional movement, but is really satisfying due to the momentum and physics you have at your disposal. And as if that and your starting running speed weren't enough, it gets better later too, because once you unlock the MOA, you're able to further improve your abilities with whatever other animal you happen to have equipped at the same time as it. And let me just get this right out of the way, that's extremely fun to play around with. One sec, you're here minding your own business, and then you let out a quick meep meep, and you're off to the races. Like, okay, I mean it is, but you do actually get the cheetah from winning a literal go-kart race that I'll touch on in a little bit, so it wasn't entirely me just brandishing an expression all willy-nilly in the Wily Wars. That last part was, though. Sorry. And as if unlocking new animal companions wasn't enough, you can also learn to do a long jump fairly early in the game, can upgrade your sword to one that isn't covered in rust, throw your sword like a boomerang for a simple and always available ranged attack, and you can sometimes straight up stack 2 of your abilities at once for special effects. While the general gameplay loop found here feels a bit cut and pasted, there's no denying that it's been dressed up with high quality presentation and several notable twists in the form of its animal buddy system that make it a ton of fun to play. And while I wouldn't go as far to say that the puzzles or boss battles the game offers are revolutionary either, they're still pretty fun too and are also spectacular from a technical level as well as how easy a feat they made it look to pull off doing. Some of my favorite moments from the game included a quest about halfway through it where you're transformed into an unarmed slime monster and need to hide from a murderous adventurer, a sky dungeon that has you climbing and platforming to the top of the world, and the series of block puzzles you'll need to complete in the desert in order to find an oasis. Plus, there's also a few segments that shake up the gameplay with mini-games, such as the go-kart race I mentioned earlier, which plays a bit like Rare's seriously underrated RC Pro-Am series, and even a mini-boss of sorts right before the final boss battle that's basically just a Pac-Man clone. Yeah, you heard me right, the game that's famous for being a Legend of Zelda clone also straight up becomes a Pac-Man knockoff in its final minutes too. Hey, so what do you call a guy at an all-you-can-eat buffet? Pac-Man. Huh? Wow, okay. Yeah, somebody better call me an ambulance, because I think I'm dying out here. No, really. Between the Disney princess-like farmland critters, or the South Parkian ones if you want to be a degenerate, and the couple of mini-games and alternate gameplay styles they threw into the mix, there's a ton to do in Crusader of Centy. It may be a fairly short game, my playthrough actually clocked in at just 6 or 7 hours, but it rarely gives you a second to breathe and it's streamlined enough to keep you moving forward with only a few moments where you might end up feeling a teeny bit lost. Better yet, the fairly linear structure of the game, especially for the genre it's in, doesn't entirely lead to Soleil completely rejecting the concept of exploration outside of its puzzles either. It certainly cuts back on the amount of exploration you can do by refusing to give you an overworld to run around in, but you're still encouraged to run around the areas you have access to in order to solve additional puzzles, in order to expand your health bar, or get one of the game's few optional Swiss Army friends.
You're my friend now. We're having soft tacos later.
You can even argue that the game encourages you to do this by straight up placing one of its coolest would-be secrets in plain view. In Anemone Beach, which is named after a type of flower that traditionally grows in subtropical climates, by the way, none other than Sonic the Hedge Boy can be seen catching a few Ray the Flying Squirrels in between adventures. And if you decide to work your way over to him, you can even talk to him and get shooed away by Sonic too. Although the game doesn't have any other Easter eggs like that one, you could easily interpret that exchange as blowing the door wide open on exploration for you as a player and reminding you to try and see what other secrets you can uncover as you continue your adventure. It's just a shame though that outside of some additional goodies, there isn't really much that's even worth collecting. I mean, you do get extra health and those optional companions, which are all fine and dandy, but I didn't feel particularly compelled to try and find that stuff on account of how much of a breeze the game itself was. Honestly, Ragnacenty's difficulty may have been my biggest gripe with it, as my predilection for cozier or easier and more approachable games like it notwithstanding, it ends up making the entire adventure feel a bit slight, especially on account of how it plays off of the title's generally fast pace. There's a lot to love about the world of Centy, but on account of how you never feel particularly challenged or like you have your back up against the wall, it's harder for you to relish in your progress and victories in the way that you'd want to. This may be fine if it's your first time playing a game in the genre, of course, but it leaves people with even the slightest bit of experience with the Legend of Zelda game or anything like it out in the dark. And that's a huge shame too, because as I previously established, the game was designed to be the Genesis's take on Zelda. It was the headlining game for a Japanese promotion designed to entice players to pick up the Mega Drive and presumably in some cases set aside or sell their Super Famicoms to do so. I just assume that it makes it kinda weak for the console's take on a Zelda game to be as easy as this one was, because while this is undeniably a great time, it feels like it's keeping things at a respectable but still comfortable trot when it could be a bit more daring in its construction. One of the places where the game probably could have used a bit more development is in its bosses though. The progression of the dungeons or levels leading up to them are fine enough on account of how they start pretty simple and straightforward and then increasingly force you to stack your abilities in slightly different configurations and switch between them, but the fights that they lead to largely feel sequestered to a single strategy for victory. It would have been nice to see more multi-stage bosses or mini-bosses make it into the game as a means of really testing your abilities. It would have helped make you feel like you were going up against increasingly dangerous foes as you yourself became a more formidable opponent for them, and it would have stopped the battles from feeling like a single combat gimmick stacked against a higher health count. Even the game's final boss, which comes after a mini-boss rush that was so easy that I didn't even bat an eyelash at it despite usually hating boss rushes with a passion, felt pretty underwhelming. You literally just use one of your animal friendos to expose the final boss's weak spot before switching to a more powerful combo if you want to ratchet up your damage. Once you figure out that you need to do that during the battle itself, you can basically get through the entire fight in like a minute or two without losing any health. Not to sound hyperbolic or anything, but the only time I found myself getting even remotely frustrated with the game was towards the end of it when I found myself needing to flip through my animal buddies like they were a Rolodex in quick succession all the time. And it wasn't a good frustration either because it felt arbitrary due to me feeling in control of every situation I was thrown into. The problem was that it wasn't the type of frustration you feel when you know a game could checkmate you at any given moment. It was the frustration in knowing that the game was trying to make an otherwise simple challenger boss fight it knows you'll get past take as long as possible. And bosses that just refuse to die after you've already won are the worst kinds of boss fights to get stuck in.
Chill the f*** out, all right? Ronnie? Ronnie, you're not at 100%, all right? Just, your throat's broken, you're...
Alright, I think you get the point I'm trying to make about the gameplay. It's good, but flawed. It's sharp enough to leave a mark, but not deep enough to kill you quickly. But how does the game compare to A Link to the Past? I already went over the different emphasis that Crusader of the Penny or whatever had in regards to its storytelling, so I'm gonna try and keep this a bit brief. The lack of a serious tone felt like a very deliberate decision on the part of the developers, and it was a kind of interesting direction for them to take the game in due to the inevitability of, and probably intentionally baited comparisons to the Legend of Zelda that the game was eventually gonna get. As I played through and wrote this video back in early March, because yeah, videos get worked on from as early as 2 full months before they ever get uploaded because this is a one-man gig and videos take a while to make when you're not getting paid for it, one of the questions I kept asking myself was whether or not I was referencing Zelda too much in my script. On the one hand, Crusader of Centy was clearly inspired by the title, and as such, it stood to reason that I should build parts of my review around that inspiration on account of it being a well-known frame of reference. On the other hand though, I was making a review of Ragnacenty, not A Link to the Past. After what I hoped was enough deliberation on my part though, I came to the conclusion that I needed to reference The Legend of Zelda however much I ended up needing to reference it on account of how much of the game was actually directly inspired by it. Even the parts of the game that are different from it feel like they may benefit from being explained within that context too, as, well, they may be different for a reason. Just to make sure we're all on the same page though, I thought it would be a good idea to just take a sec to quickly classify several of the more common types of clone products. You have your run-of-the-mill knockoff or bootleg, which tries to position itself as the real deal and is more often than not just a counterfeit. Your usually clearly budget product that's inspired by something and is sometimes illegally or unethically marketed as a follow-up or spiritual successor to that product and is looking to ride off the coattails of that original. And you have your more earnestly created products that clearly show their inspiration from something, but is also genuinely able to and tries to stand on its own 2 feet without being propped up by that other work. Personally, I'd fit Crusader of Centy somewhere between the second or third categories that I just listed. It very obviously pulls quite a bit from Zelda, and because of it is difficult to discuss without mentioning the title responsible for its inception. I mean, there's probably a reason why literally every other review to ever come out about the game has framed it as being Sega's Zelda, you know? Hell, look at the title to the thing. Its American title, The Crusader of Centy, directly imitates the naming convention of The Legend of Zelda. While it does lack the word "the" at the beginning of it, it follows the same exact noun preposition subject structure that Nintendo's franchise has. It's literally just a B-movie approximation of Nintendo's title in the same way that a movie like Roger Corman's Battle Beyond the Stars is very clearly a riff on... And the comparisons don't stop there. The game's story centers around a society of monsters living underground in a separate world due to their weakness and fear of light. They were driven there a long time ago by a hero, and Centy's king now requires young boys to train for the day that such warriors may be needed again. In a lot of ways, it's very similar to A Link to the Past story. There are differences for sure, but looking at the broad strokes painted by both games of a strong division between light and dark, children who wear distinct and kinda goofy hats taking up arms to defend the kingdom and all, they're kinda the same. Interestingly, Ragnacenty even has parallels to the 2 Zelda games that got released after it hit the market. It features time travel as a fairly major component of its story a full 4 years before Ocarina of Time came out in Japan, and
Spoilers.
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 Sorry, it must be my TV again. Anyway, spoiler alert for this and Link's Awakening, I guess. And even kinda share similarities with the ending for Link's Awakening. I mean, it doesn't literally share endings with Link's Awakening or anything, but it does jokingly share the idea that's more or less the ending to a game that hadn't come out yet. Basically, once you've defeated the final boss in a battle that takes place in the past, you end up changing history so that monsters were never a problem to begin with. Because of this, once you go back to the present, you find that things have been changed slightly. The statue of the hero that was in the town square, who was actually you during your adventure, by the way, has been replaced, and upon getting home, you find out that your dad, who's been dead for the entire game, is no longer unalived. Its overwriting a history is similar to how Link's Awakening ended with Link finding out that his entire adventure was a dream, even though we know it isn't quite that clear cut because the game literally tells us that these events happened. And the same thing is the case in Crusader of Centy, because as far as the townsfolk in Soleil are concerned, Corona's adventure is just a made-up story. But the thing is that we know better since we got to participate in his time travel shenanigans for ourselves, and we also get to see his animal buddies that he teamed up with recreate the ending to The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou while the credits roll. While not directly similar to each other, they touch on the same idea of going on an adventure that, due to its own resolution, ultimately becomes null and void. They both end with you right back where you started, with only the knowledge of the journey you went on as proof that it happened. However, while it's interesting to see that Gao and Nextech sort of beat Ocarina of Time to the punch with the time travel and all, as well as inadvertently struck the same wavelength as Link's Awakening would a few months later, I can't help but feel like they didn't do much that was worthwhile with those ideas either. The introduction of time travel just sort of happens 2/3 of the way through the game, and it felt a bit contrived because of it. At least to my, admittedly sometimes cynical, but I swear I'm working on it in therapy eyes, the time travel only really existed to force you to revisit previously unlocked areas for a few bonus boss battles before wrapping things up. I didn't really mind that it was doing that or anything, hence why I'm only bringing it up now, but it also didn't add anything of substance to the game as a whole aside from setting up the resolution of its story. And even then, it ends up throwing out the few good ideas that the game had shared leading up to it, such as the idea that not all of the monsters you're killing are even that evil to begin with. It really felt more like they were just trying to find a way to reuse assets they had already created for the game, as opposed to just trying to give us some new environments to explore. Compared to the Legend of Zelda's use of both of those ideas, it feels a bit flat and undercooked, though I do also have to remind everyone of the fact that the game clearly wasn't trying to compete with Zelda in terms of its tone. Again, it's a bit more Star Tropics than anything, though even that may be pushing it a bit. Something I found really cool though was the fact that Crusader of Centy even includes what I'd consider to be a straight up cameo by Link, and even went as far as to wrap it within the game's forest area for maximum Zelda-ness. It happens about 1/3 into the game when you find yourself running through the woods. It's a fairly normal environment, all things considered. There are a few enemies here and there, some decent music, and an absolute ton of tall pieces of grass that could have easily been plucked straight out of a Zelda game. Anyway, you'll eventually enter a different part of the forest and have your body stolen by an NPC who runs off to court a woman in a nearby village. Your new character sprite, which is green, just like Link's tunic, belongs to a defenseless slime person who ends up getting attacked and chased around by a nearby adventurer. Which brings us to the cameo. As you explore the area, you'll end up meeting what the game described as a wacky magician named Klin, who's a dead ringer for the hero of Hyrule himself, and whose name is literally an anagram for Link. And this is a dead ringer for King Bowser. Right? When you talk to him, he'll say that he was behind the body switching in order to help a friend out, eventually call you an unfortunate victim of circumstance, and then basically tell you that you're up a creek without a paddle. It's a pretty funny sequence in itself that's made funnier because it later throws the slightest bit of shade Klin's way by implying that he, and Link by proxy, were way in over their heads and that he isn't actually strong enough to fix things on his own. It's a super brief scene, truth be told, but I thought it was really cool on account of it literally acknowledging the fact that the game owes some of its identity to Zelda. I mean, it even went to the lengths of making Klin be the one responsible for the case of identity theft, which is about as on the nose as things could have gotten. They may as well have had him let out a
Well, excuse me.
two while they were at it. The comparisons to Zelda don't have to end there either though, as even the things that the game doesn't have in common with the series are worth holding up side by side against it. Take the overworld, for example. One of the most iconic parts of any Zelda game is running through the overworld to the franchise's incredible theme, right? Well, isn't it kinda strange that Crusader of Centy doesn't have any overworld to speak of? The closest thing we got to an area resembling a traditional Zelda overworld was probably the forest I just described, and that was a fairly small area that was also fairly clearly intended to resemble The Legend of Zelda. And it's just really fascinating to think about why this is the case. Did the developers think that traveling from dungeon to dungeon in a Zelda game was boring or too time-consuming? Were they trying to keep to a quick and snappy pace so that Mega Drive owners that were less familiar with role-playing and non-linear gameplay would feel a bit more at home? It goes pretty far against the blueprint that Legend of Zelda games are commonly derived from. They're usually supposed to be a sprawling open world that invites you to uncover its secrets and relish in your ability to do so. But Soleil, like I mentioned earlier, isn't really like that. The combat's even a bit different too. The Legend of Zelda's action feels a bit more strategic and methodical than Centy's does. You can honestly just brute force your way through most of the encounters in this game if you want to, and while you do have an in-game currency that's similar to the Legend of Zelda's that you could use to rent off one-off animal companions for a few extra abilities, it's also heavily de-emphasized in the gameplay. The titles of both games even kinda reflect that difference in gameplay too, if you think about it. The word crusade is such strong, charged language. It implies a certain unwillingness to dilly-dally and break from your quest, which is fitting given the tone of the game itself, but also makes sense when juxtaposed against the railed traversal from one area to another. Conversely, the word legend feels grander. It feels like it does have the room to explore and pick at the world map with whatever sense of curiosity the player brings with them. It feels somewhat
legendary. Legendary. Legendary.
Yeah, that. It feels like that. And then there are the moments where Crusader of Centy actually tries to play with some of the conventions from Zelda. A similarity between the two of them that I failed to mention earlier is the fact that both characters are largely mute. It sounds like it would be a pretty open and shut similarity, truth be told, but it's actually given a layer of complexity by the game. Fairly early in your adventure, you meet a fortune teller who gives you the ability to talk to animals in exchange for your ability to speak to humans. You eventually get that ability back too, but it leads to you spending a decent chunk of your time in the world of Centy seeing unintelligible wingdings whenever you try to talk to someone.
When is the next bus to Bikini Bottom?
What? I can't understand your accent.
It feels a tiny bit like a wink and nudge towards fans who remember Link being a mostly mute protagonist in his games too. I don't think that elements like the lack of an overworld or the explanation for your character's muteness ever build up to anything, or that there's necessarily any sort of thematic value to them, but they're fun details to recognize and point to as a person that's at least somewhat familiar with the formula that Soleil is pulling from. And I feel like the bigger a fan you are of something, and assuming you're willing to give it a shot, the more likely you should be to enjoy a knockoff or clone of a product for that reason. Maybe that's a huge part of why this game was such a blast to play for me. Other than the fact that the game itself was genuinely a lot of fun and really technically impressive, being able to compare it to The Legend of Zelda only stood to elevate my enjoyment of it. It felt a bit like watching something like the aforementioned Battle Beyond the Stars as a person that loves Star Wars because of how you can playfully poke fun at their similarities. Similarly, it's like listening to an artist do a cover of a song you really like and trying to study the strange creative flourishes that they took with it. And speaking of music, I should probably briefly touch on Soleil's soundtrack since I haven't yet and how it shapes up against The Legend of Zelda's. It doesn't. Like, at all. Whereas Zelda bounces back and forth between rustic and epic, the Genesis counterpart sounds a bit more like your traditional JRPG. Some parts of its soundtrack even reminded me of Phantasy Star 2 a bit, which is probably just because of the Genesis's hardware and how few JRPGs the console got in comparison to the SNES. There's nothing wrong with it or anything, and it even has a couple of bangers to its name, but it's definitely lacking in the memorable themes that Nintendo's game had, as well as the oomph that it brought to the adventure's thematics. While the Legend of Zelda games have always had fun and interesting characters, there's always been a varying sense of impending doom attached to them too. Whether it's because the moon is voyaging towards the planet, Ganon's about to unleash hell on Hyrule, or some other variation of the second one for the millionth time, Zelda games have almost always told a reasonably straight-laced story and sprinkled in some humor and silliness for levity.
Well done, Zelda, but you have a lot to learn before you become a master.
But Ragnacenty often feels like it's doing the opposite. It's a game about a little kid running around with a sword and meeting Sonic the Hedgehog, getting turned into Legally Not a Slime from Dragon Quest, and straight up using time travel to Control-Alt-Delete his adventure from ever happening in the process. It's almost fitting that the game shares elements of Link's Awakening's dream ending and has this tone too, because in a weird way, the adventure operates like a dream would. The storytelling and world feel a bit scattered and random thanks to stuff like go-karts appearing alongside knights, people aren't where they should be, and the whole thing plays out in this somewhat disjointed and undetailed fashion. Like, yeah, this is totally a dream. Why not? I mean, people still regularly argue over whether or not the ending to Inception was a dream, so why not this? It neatly explains the game's tone and general atmosphere. If you choose to believe that it is a dream, you could even go as far to suggest that Corona was explicitly dreaming about being in his very own Zelda game, and you could take that as a metatextual confirmation that Sega just wanted their own Zelda clone. I think I'm gonna stop there because claiming the game was a dream all along and then throwing it at the wall to see if the idea sticks is entering game theory territory. Also, are we not gonna say anything about the fact that the main character's canon name is Corona? Nothing at all? That he had two dimwits for parents that were okay with naming their only son after a fucking beer? Really? Like I said at the top of the video, clones have always gotten a bad rap from most consumers. And it's somewhat understandable that they do, I guess, since a number of them can often ride the line of infringing on intellectual property law or straight up lapse into the side of copyright infringement, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the people who choose to dismiss a game on those grounds could also miss out on some truly great titles like Crusader of Centy in the process. Because that's almost what happened with me. Even though I had heard about the game from the Gaming Historian's video on it from a few years ago and knew it was a good game, I was fairly on the fence about sitting down to review it as opposed to just covering an actual Zelda title for my channel. The only reason I ended up picking this one over one of Nintendo's classic adventure titles was the fact that in the time it took me to record, write, and produce this thing, I knew I'd be putting it out around the same time as Tears of the Kingdom would launch and thought that YouTube would already be oversaturated with all things Link and Zelda. I'm really glad that I decided to play through this though. While I'd never try to argue that it isn't a Legend of Zelda clone, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. After all, it's pretty awesome to be able to see what a Zelda game would have turned out like had it been created for Sega's hardware. On top of that, it's not like we can't just enjoy both of them too these days. We aren't exactly in some do or die situation where we need to wipe one off the face of the planet, you know?
I don't know what's going on with you two, but I love you both.
Playing Ragnacenty also made me think about the nature of video game clones a lot. How some insanely popular, truly iconic titles from the past several decades have been clones of other games and how we haven't really batted an eyelash at them for it. For example, remember Zuma by PopCap Games? It's an insanely popular puzzle game from way back when that was actually just a clone of a Japanese exclusive called Puzzloop. There's also stuff like Saints Row 2 as well as, Saints Row 2. Those games were fairly blatant Grand Theft Auto clones at a time when GTA all but had a monopoly on the third-person sandbox genre. The massive success of id Software's Doom kicked off a metric ton of first-person shooters that included the likes of some truly great games like Shadow Warrior, Star Wars Dark Forces, and even Bungie's first major success, Marathon. My point is that clones have always been around, and that a decent number of them may have even been pretty great games. I mean, I grew up playing a bunch of Battlefield 1942 on PC as well as Star Wars Battlefront 2 on my PS2, and I never really cared that Battlefront was clearly a clone of DICE's World War II shooter. As far as I was concerned, it was just a really fun game. And what about the hordes of indie games made by passionate developers as spiritual successors to games that they themselves grew up playing? Nowadays, I think we're more likely to just say that something is inspired by another game or that it shares a more specific subgenre with one as opposed to just calling it an out-and-out clone. Because really, games like Oceanhorn, Tunic, or even something like the genuinely underrated as hell Eastward all carry varying bits of Zelda's DNA, and because of that, you could make the argument that they're just clones. We just don't call them that because they aren't using stolen assets that mislead you into downloading them off the Google Play Store. Maybe that's what makes something a clone these days. Theft. Back in the 90s, everyone and their mom called Crusader of Centy a Zelda clone due to it being about a boy with a doofy hat going on a globe-trotting quest. But nowadays, that's literally just the adventure genre. Over the years, the meaning of the word clone has shifted in video games from being a game that wears its influence on its sleeves, such as in games like Diddy Kong Racing or Crash Team Racing, clearly owing a bit of their design to Mario Kart, to being a piece of garbage made to manipulate people. The term feels like it's been diluted to the worst of the examples I mentioned back in the second chapter. Meanwhile, the other two examples of clones that I labeled have just become part of whatever genre the game they were inspired by is a part of. Because we're no longer quite as trigger happy when it comes to calling a party minigame collection a Mario Party clone or a 2D adventure platformer a knockoff of Super Metroid. We just call them party games or Metroidvanias. Thinking about it that way, you can almost thank games like Crusader of Centy for coming out and helping codify the Zelda formula into being its own specific type of game. It sorta needed to be considered a clone in order for Zelda-likes to have a chance of becoming a thing to begin with. Plus, you gotta consider why these clones exist in the first place. While some of them may have come about because a lot of them managed to find success alongside the work that inspired them due to a part of the market not being fulfilled. In the case of some popular games like Stardew Valley, they got made and became as popular as they did in large part due to the lack of new and high-quality Harvest Moon games on the market. Likewise, there are a ton of quirky, humor-centric RPGs that have come out over the years or have been in development as spiritual successors to Earthbound because, well, there hasn't been a new Earthbound game for longer than there were Earthbound titles being made in the first place. Like, if you happen to be a huge fan of the classic 2D Zelda formula and really wish you had a new one that you could sink your teeth into, why not just play Soleil? It's basically a 2D Zelda game in almost every way but name, and while it may not be as good or 100% like the real thing, it may still scratch that itch for you. It's been almost 10 years since Nintendo put out a quote-unquote traditional top-down Zelda title, so games like Soleil, Tunic, and Oceanhorn are somewhat vital for those looking for something in that vein. Likewise, even though Breath of the Wild now has a sequel in Tears of the Kingdom, that's also why I think something like Ubisoft's Immortals Phoenix Rising made sense as a product. Besides the fact that the game itself looks fairly alright, it's perfect for people who don't own a Nintendo Switch and want to get in on a game like Breath of the Wild. And even if you do own a Switch, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, you may also just find yourself wanting more after you've played them.
You say that's not quite enough? You'd like to try something a little more extensive, shall we say? Okay, try this on for size.
Maybe it's just me, but whenever I think of the term clones, I always sort of imagine some nefarious doppelganger that seeks to replace the original, but that isn't really the case when it comes to video games. More often than not, they aren't so much trying to overwrite the impact of the original or take its spot in pop culture, but rather coexist alongside it. At their worst, they're harmless, and at their best, they can run the gamut of being good to great, which is exactly how I view Crusader of Centy, somewhere between good and great. Overall, Crusader of Centy was a really fun and cozy game that also just happens to be a great supplement to the classic 2D Zelda Overture. Given its short length and relatively low difficulty, you could easily slot a playthrough of this game in between a couple of Nintendo's releases and walk away from it feeling a bit refreshed from the slight change of pace that it offered you. If you're looking for something a bit different but still well within the confines of the top-down adventure formula, I can't suggest Crusader of Centy enough. There's a ton of high-quality games inspired by The Legend of Zelda out there, but given how under-discussed this game is, I feel obligated to recommend that you seek it out sometime. It's short, it's sweet, it's to the point, and sometimes that's all a game really needs to be. Well, that's it. I'm done reviewing the game, and I'm still here. Got to have a minor breakthrough about the nature of clones in video games, and nobody is so much checked in on me in the process. You know, I'd laugh if only the sensation of air entering my lungs didn't feel like a star collapsing in on itself. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the video. Be sure to answer the question of the day if you haven't already, and to recommend the video to some friends or something if you want to help the channel grow. On top of that, you can also subscribe to my Patreon or donate to my Buy Me a Coffee in order to support the channel that way and get some cool bonus goodies in the process.
So yeah. Bye.